panel is called Evidencing Birth Prevention and Forced Labour. Today with us we have Nathan Rusa and James LEIBOLD. We have Darren BYLER. We have Adrian ZENZ, Nyrola ELIMÄ, and Yona Diamond. Yona Diamond is our chair today, and I'll allow her to introduce each of our panelists, several of which are virtually attending today. Thank you.
Panel on evidencing two of the major trends in the region regarding forced labor and birth prevention measures. Two of the big picture trends that really speak to the mass atrocities, and all of our guests I have the deepest respect and admiration for. I'll first introduce Dr. James LEIBOLD, Senior Fellow at the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, an Associate Professor at La Trobe University and the head of its Department of Politics, Media and Philosophy. And he is one of the world's leading experts on ethnic policies in China. Dr. LEIBOLD.
Thanks very much, for the introduction. Can everybody hear me? Hoping the technology works. I was a bit terrified after watching Tim's presentation. I'm going to try to share my slides, and fingers crossed that it actually works. Can people see the slides? Yes, no, I can't hear. All good? Someone, please, shout out.
We can't see your slides yet.
Yes, we can absolutely hear, James. Thank you. Okay, James, if you would please start your presentation. Thank you.
Yeah, just give me a second. Not sure what's going on. Now? No?
Have you already started, James? Is your presentation on your screen?
No, still can't see.
Give us just one moment.
Yeah, sorry. I don't know. I'm sure I can.
James, have you shared your screen?
Yeah, not sure. Might not be doing it right. I'll just do it without the slides. I think that's probably a better idea.
Technical issues there. Thank you.
Yeah. First of all, thanks to Joe and Hannah for the miraculous effort to convene this virtual conference that brings these people from different continents together. It's really a remarkable feat, and quite sad I can't be there in person, and really sad that I can't connect with old friends and colleagues. But I'm glad that we've taken this opportunity to kind of keep this issue in the spotlight.
James, I'm very sorry to interrupt you. Would you stop sharing your screen?
If I could do that, we'll see. I don't even know how to, I thought it was sharing. I wasn't sharing. Yeah.
Slides, but we can kind of see a vacant screen where we think you are sharing your screen. There we are. Thank you so much.
Okay. Better to keep it that. Go low tech. Yeah. So my talk is based on a May 2001 policy brief that I co-authored with my colleague Nathan Rusa at the Australian Strategic Policy Institute. The report is part of the U.S. State Department-funded Xinjiang Data Project. If you haven't seen our website, I urge you to check it out. I've had great pleasure to work with people like Nathan, Vicky Xu, and other young Australian researchers at ASPE over the last couple of years, doing some empirical-based research as it relates to Xinjiang. In my remarks, I just want to start kind of broadly and then kind of narrow into recent measures, population control measures in Xinjiang before kind of zooming out and looking at the big picture. There's no way I can do justice to the report in 15 minutes, so really urge you to hop onto the website and download the report and read it. I want to contend to you that from its origins, the Chinese Communist Party has literally been kind of obsessed with population control, its structure, composition, size, and quality. Of course, this is something that all states do, but you could argue that population control is a key modus operandi of CCP governance. In many ways, it's been the key to the party's survival and success over the course of its 60-odd years of rule. Two of the most obvious examples are the household registration system, as well as family planning policies. Don't have time to go into detail of those policies, but I think it's really important to remember that the crackdown in Xinjiang didn't occur in a policy vacuum. I sometimes fear that our kind of myopic view of Xinjiang is preventing us from kind of seeing wider policy trends under Xi Jinping. And of course, efforts to control population, predate even Xi, as do family planning policies. Now, in the modern era, of course, the Chinese state has adopted, as Jim Millward quite clearly pointed out this morning, a colonial strategy to exert its control over its frontier regions. And transmigration has been a key part of that colonial strategy. And as a result, we've seen really dramatic shifts in the population structure in Xinjiang. So you go from 5% share of population in 1949 up to around 42% today. Yet the kind of inflow of Han has really been balanced traditionally by the really high birth rates amongst indigenous populations. Now, when China first implemented its one-child policy in 1979, it decided to provide ethnic minorities like the Uyghurs with preferential exemptions. It was believed at the time this would assist with their development. And generally speaking, minorities with urban hukou were allowed 2 children, and those with rural hukou 3 children, and in some cases for remote villages in southern Xinjiang, up to 4 children. But as a part of a kind of wider shift in ethnic policy that occurred under Xi Jinping, which I've written about, the Xinjiang Autonomous Region revised its family planning regulations in 2017 and adopted a uniform 2-child policy. And it was that new regulation that really became the legal justification for a strike hard campaign against illegal births at that same time. What drove this shift in policy in part was concerns about what the Chinese government believed was an unbalanced population structure in Xinjiang. That is, the concentration of Uyghurs in the southern part of Xinjiang and the Han in the north. And this was viewed in the eyes of policymakers as a direct threat to China's national security. And scholars began to talk about the issue of population security, especially in the wake of the 2009 Urumqi riots. These concerns led to calls among scholars for a new set of policies and incentives to stop population outflows and to attract Han to the Xinjiang border region. Also for renewed efforts for what was termed interethnic mingling, as well as the strengthening of identification with the Zhenghua Minzu and the Chinese language and culture, as well as deepening reforms to the hukou system in Xinjiang, something but I think it's kind of been understudied to the current time. In response to these concerns about population security, Chinese policymakers frequently made reference to the need to optimize the population structure of Xinjiang. So this is a euphemistic term for literally making superior the population structure. It has the term itself to optimize, throwbacks to eugenics language in the Republican period. And what scholars and policymakers meant by optimizing the population structure had several elements to it. First, it was about improving the quality or the suzhou of the population of Xinjiang by pulling people away from isolated, rural, and chiefly Uyghur lifestyles, and then inculcating them with modern Chinese lifestyles through Mandarin state education, as well as disciplining in factories, farms, as well as schools. Second, it was also about balancing the population structure by diluting the concentration of the Uyghur population in southern Xinjiang, which in turn meant both promoting outward migration of Uyghurs from southern Xinjiang, as well as encouraging inward migration of Han into these areas. But at heart, I would argue population optimization was really about transforming the physical landscape and the human geography of southern Xinjiang in order to render it ultimately more like Guangdong or Hubei. In short, it's become a really important part of China's colonial mission in Xinjiang. As I said, the optimization of the Xinjiang population structure involved concerted efforts to lure more Han settlers into the region. The region's chief colonizing vehicle, the Xinjiang Production and Construction Corps, or the Bingtuan, has plans to settle thousands of mostly Han migrants in the region, chiefly in southern Xinjiang. It has a mission to move south into that region. And in the report, we document a number of examples of Bingtuan regiments actively recruiting poor Han peasants and workers from across China to move to Xinjiang, including providing them with preferential family planning policy exemptions. With the arrival of Chen Chongguo as the new party secretary in August of 2016, Xinjiang embarked upon this widespread crackdown on instability or counterterrorism in party speak that saw the construction of these re-education camps that are well known. But what is perhaps less well known is that around the same time, the party did initiate a series of strike hard campaigns against what it deemed illegal births and lax family planning enforcement, particularly focused on Uyghurs and other indigenous communities, as well as southern Xinjiang. The campaign, which was launched in April 2017 by Chen Chongguo, explicitly targeted the 4 prefectures of southern Xinjiang, where the vast majority of the indigenous population lives. But there's also evidence that this crackdown was more widespread, reached into other parts of Xinjiang, and clearly disproportionately targeted Uyghurs, Kazakhs, and other rural indigenous populations. Like elsewhere in China, the Chinese Communist Party turned to campaign-style implementation strategy with an explicit target of reducing the birth rate by at least 4 per mille on 2016 levels. And in order to accomplish that target, and we present evidence that shows that they actually in many places exceeded that quite easily, they turned to a toolkit of coercive implementation measures. And these are measures that were used by the party state in Han areas for many decades prior to this crackdown. And they included very large punitive fines for illegal births, daubing in, literally daub-in lines for people to report illegal births, as well as monetary rewards for people who turn people in for illegal births, coercive birth control measures, forced abortions, sterilization for childbearing age women, women who refuse to cooperate or are seen as having births in excess of quotas were threatened or even sent off to re-education. And finally, the perhaps most important part of the coercive approach was to really crack down on party and government officials who were supposed to be policing these policies by making it something that not only would see them not promoted, but also could see them demoted or even expelled from the party or their government positions. Now, at the heart of the report is some great empirical, quantitative work by my colleague Nathan Rooser. What we wanted to try to do was try to empirically measure the impact of the Strike Hard campaign on the population structure of Xinjiang. In order to do that, we set out to build a new data set of county-level birth rate statistics using the government's own publicly available statistics, chiefly from the annual Xinjiang Statistical Yearbook. Then we marshaled this data to analyze trends across nationalities and spatial regions in Xinjiang, both before and after the 2016 crackdown. And then we also tried to look at it comparatively with other countries using the UN population database as a comparative set of figures. For the full details, and it's a complicated methodology, like any attempts to study Xinjiang, you need to be a bit creative in your methodology. I would refer you to the appendix of the report. Now, our results, in short, demonstrate a really precipitous and unprecedented drop in the official birth rate in Xinjiang, falling nearly 50% between the 2 years between 2017 and 2019. We also demonstrate how the largest declines occurred in counties where Uyghurs and other indigenous communities were concentrated. To put it another way, over those 2 periods, 2-year period between 2017 and 2019, Xinjiang's birth rate declined from a rate similar to those of neighboring countries like Mongolia and Kazakhstan to now slightly higher than that of Japan, where the low birth rate is seen as a national crisis. So it gives you a sense of the impact of this crackdown on so-called illegal births. In conclusion, I want to look briefly at some of the implications for the findings of our report. The first thing to point out is that the most recent Xinjiang Statistical Yearbook omitted key demographic statistics, including crude birth rate by county level administrative units. As a result, it is now virtually impossible to update our data set or to systematically track the results of Xinjiang's birth and population control policies. And that, while not a smoking gun, certainly tells you that there is something going on there that the Chinese government would like to hide from the view of outside researchers. That said, our data set and findings certainly do offer new evidence that the Chinese government's actions in Xinjiang might contravene the 1949 Genocide Convention, although we also urge that additional research is really required to establish the intent of these policies to actually meet the legal definition of genocide under the convention. In his latest article, Adrian ZENZ has argued that the discussion amongst Chinese academics and policymakers about the optimization of population structure in Xinjiang likely proves the existence of genocidal intent. And certainly that might be the case, but I'm no legal expert, and I know Yona and Joe Finley Smith and others have done a lot of great work on trying to understand definitions of genocide and apply them to Xinjiang, and I think that's really important work, and I certainly encourage that to continue. Yet in my conclusion, I want to kind of make a case for thinking about the Chinese Communist Party's policies in Xinjiang as suggesting a colonial rather than a genocidal intent. Now, if you put aside the legal definition of genocide, and again, I'm not a legal expert, and think about the kind of normative and popular uses of the term, the first thing that comes to mind, or at least for me, is the concentration camps of Nazi Germany, or the terrible genocidal efforts that occurred in Rwanda or Cambodia, where we saw the kind of physical annihilation of an ethnic or religious group through systematic massacres. Anyone who's looked at Xinjiang knows that this is not what's happening in Xinjiang today. Certainly aspects of China's policy are highly destructive and might, certainly resulting, as we saw this morning, in cultural genocide, and might ultimately result in ethnocide over the long term. But they also, and chiefly, represent a kind of colonial intent to ultimately transform and not exterminate the physical and social landscape of Xinjiang and other peripheral regions. In fact, debating the legal definition and CCP's culpability in Xinjiang is certainly important, but we can't let it distract ourselves from the kind of wider policy setting and the way in Xi Jinping is really kind of turbocharging the transformative resolve around a series of really important policy innovations that are occurring across China's colonial possessions, whether they be from Kashgar to Hong Kong or Lhasa to Hohhot. And so I'll just end with that, and maybe this is kind of a reflection of where I've come after doing a really seriously deep dive into Xinjiang over the last really 5 years, that increasingly I see myself wanting to come out of that rabbit hole and zoom out and try to understand how what's happening in Xinjiang actually represents a range of really important policy innovations that are at the heart of China's new authoritarianism under Xi Jinping's new era. And I'll end there, and apologies about the slideshow, and thanks for your time and attention.
Thanks, Dr. LEIBOLD. Thank you for the wonderful presentation, and indeed very shocking that that these public statistics are now omitted from the latest statistical yearbook, which in and of itself should be considered evidence of continuing trends. And I'd like to introduce now Darren BYLER, assistant professor at Simon Fraser University, who is coming out with 2 books, In the Camps, China's High-Tech Penal Colony, and Terror, Capitalism, Uyghur Dispossession and Masculinity in a Chinese City. And he will be presenting on smart workhouses, unfree labor, and Uyghur futures in Northwest China.
Well, thank you very much. I'll try to share my presentation here with you all. It's a real honor to be here. Let's see here. Can you see that? Perhaps. Thank you, Joe and Hannah, for organizing this. It's really something to have an international conference that's bringing all these people together during this time. I'll be talking about smart workhouses, which are spaces that are associated with camps where former detainees are sent to work, and how that affects Uyghur life. The paper, such as it is, argues that smart for-profit workhouses outfitted with checkpoints, surveillance systems, smartphone apps, and state minders mobilize a negative eugenics program by separating families. And it's doing this in a way that supplements a deeply invasive zero illegal births program. So it's supplementing the public health initiative by simply separating people and delaying social reproduction. Smart workhouses accompany surveillance, and accompanying surveillance impose a deprivation of liberty that is systematic and targets individuals based on their ethnicity and faith. by deeming significant portions of adult Uyghur and Kazakh populations, I'm missing a word there, sending them into carceral industrial spaces, a biopower of making to live, rather than a necropolitics, which is making people die, begins to shape the future reproduction of Uyghur society, producing a slow but intentional process of social elimination, or as Chinese state officials put it, ethnic extinction. I'm going to kind of zoom in on one particular case, one prefecture, Aksu, and look at the experiences of one family. So this is less of a macro view of the situation and more of a closer examination. In 2018, we started to see factory spaces being built adjacent to the camps, the higher security areas. These spaces were often set up to manufacture textiles, and as Adrian ZENZ pointed out in one of his papers from back in 2018 or 19, he found a document that showed that the camps were becoming a carrier of the economy, and it was really presented at the level of oil and natural gas, the other resources, because so many laborers were coming out of the camps. Now, in this drone image shows sort of the proximity of the factory space to the camp. This is the high security camp area in Hotan, in a major complex that's just north of the city. And here we have dormitories for workers, within, I don't know, less than 50 meters, less than 100 meters. And then right behind it are the factories. And this is an image from inside the factory of people making something to do with shoes. It's not clear exactly in the image what they're making. In talking to former detainees, they talk about how entering the factory complexes often require going through a checkpoint that's similar to this one. This is just an illustration. It's coming from another checkpoint in Urumqi. It's not at that Hotan space. But really, it's sort of a border control type checkpoint where faces are scanned, match the ID. And electronics are often involved as well in these scans. So what does this look like in terms of a sort of individual's experience of the process of going through camps and into factories? Turn now to a young man, Skander, who's a current detainee and worker in Aksu Prefecture. I interviewed him in 2015 when I met him, and I've been in touch with his family and family members since his detention. This is as recently as a month ago. Iskander was not religious, or not very religious. When I met him, he didn't have a mustache because he thought that it would mark him as too traditional. And his family, didn't really attend the mosque, at least not regularly. He was preparing to get married. He had found a wife for him, his parents, and there was plans in the works for him to get married. And then he would take over his father's 300 mu farm, which is actually quite large for most people's farms. He's now 31 years old. When I met him 2015, that's 7 years ago, or 6 years ago, that's when he was discussing marriage. That he was detained in 2017. His detention sort of coincided with an announcement that everyone should confess their past crimes. This is an announcement from his prefecture that's associated with a new party secretary, who's this guy, Do Wangwei, who was put in power in Aksu in 2018, beginning of the year. And he announced in a speech that everyone over the age of 12, which is one of the interesting parts about this document, should go and confess any past extremism. And really what they're looking for is the 75 signs of extremism that was widely circulated throughout Xinjiang. At first, very few people confessed, but then people began to scan people's phones, looking for markers of Islamic activity. We know from other state documents that over 100,000 people's phones were stopped at this time, and they were detained for questioning. And over the year 2017 to 18, almost 1.9 million people were found to have used an now illegalized file sharing app called AirDrop, or similar to AirDrop, but it's called Zapier. Iskender was named as part of a criminal gang when his friend was detained due to a scan of his phone. And then the police officer, who was a classmate of his brother, came and said, you should really confess, and then I can maybe help you to get a more lenient sentence. And so he confessed to praying with this friend outside of a mosque 3 years before. And he thought that he would be safe because he had this relationship with the police officer. He had acted as a volunteer militia, tracking down other neighbors who were needing to be detained. And so he thought that he had done the work to get some protection. And initially he thought that the school that the police officer said he would be taken to would really be a school. But in fact, it turned out to be a closed, concentrated education and training center. The atmosphere of the space in the village was really centered around this campaign. People weren't working at this point. This is in 2015 and 16. Instead, they were participating in political activities pretty much all the time. After he confessed to going to having prayed outside of the mosque, Iskender went through an intake process that really produces a sort of standardized digital file for the individual. He had to be accurately categorized, untrustworthy, but not too. His crime was not too serious that needed to be sent to prison. His image was scanned and then put into the data set, the image of his face. This is how it's laid out in the notice, that there's this 5-step process in terms of how someone should be put into the system. In the end, you come away with a standardized digital file for the individual, and he's in the system. Over the next year, he had monthly supervised video calls with his family. And this happened in the work brigade office through some special equipment. They were allowed to have 2 visits with him in the camp, and that's really when they realized for the first time that it was a carceral space rather than a prison space, or rather than a school. And they learned later from a former detainee, an elderly person from their village who came back after he was in ill health, that Iskender had been hooded and shackled as they were transported to the space, and that they had been forced to sit. He had been forced to sit in a really standardized position inside the cell on small stools for many hours, which is something I've heard from detainees from across the region. At the end of 2018, they received a notice that Iskender would be transferred to a new textile factory that was in the county, about 100 kilometers away. That was owned by a corporation from Eastern China through a pairing assistance program. That's how the factory was built. They weren't permitted to visit the factory. He was not permitted to leave. And then 12 months later, he was transferred along with at least 20,000 other people to factories in the capital of the prefecture. And then eventually controlled phone calls began again. Since 2017, which is when Iskender was taken, his family has seen him only twice, and the rest has been these phone calls. And as far as they know, he's not being paid, but they can't say for sure because they're not really able to talk about everything that they want to talk about. What I know from interviewing other detainees is that inside these spaces, which is it's a separate track from people that are sent to factory work in Eastern China, but people that are coming out of the camps often work in front of cameras. They're subjected to body checks several times a day. In some cases, the factory floor is divided into locked cubicles, and people that work in these spaces talk about it as a space where they're treated as criminals because they're coming out of the camp system. Workers are not provided phones in some cases, and then or they are given phones, but the phones don't have internet service or phone service. They're just tracking devices. And in other cases, they're not allowed to carry. They are allowed to carry their phone, but they're subjected to scans. At the same time that Iskander was going to the factory and camp, around 70% of his family's land was taken from them without compensation, and then became a sort of collective farm, a corporate farm that was run by a Chinese company, and through an agreement with the work brigade in their village. They said that the majority of remaining villagers between the ages of 18 and 35 were sent to factories, and they also were not permitted to care for the children of detainees, other people in their village who had been taken. Those children were often just taken away, and they lost track of where they are. So I just want to emphasize this track is distinct from the detainee track, the people that are just leaving the villages to go and work in factories after they're assigned to work. But still the threat of detention, the government management always remains. 1,000 people in Aksu were given the opportunity to relinquish 379,000 acres in this manner, which resulted in job assignments for 73,000 people. So you can see that this is quite widespread. Just beginning to wrap up here, as farmers across the region were sent to prisons, camps, and factories, more than 42,000 donkeys were shipped to a collective farm associated with a camp in Yarkand. This is a painting from a farmer painting contest that depicts this process of transporting donkeys 10,000 kilometers. And it's about the process of removing people from the land, sending them to work in factories. The animals that are left behind are also sent away. So what comes out of this is a negative eugenics program, which is defined by the discouragement or prohibition of marriage and family life for those with eugenically undesirable traits such as race and ethnicity. That seems quite clear. Smart for-profit workhouses outfitted with checkpoints, surveillance systems, state minders, and digital personhood assist a negative eugenics program by separating families and foreclosing social reproduction. So Iskander, may never get married, may never have children because he's been separated from his community for so long, and really there's no end in sight. As such, there's a really intense deprivation of liberty. It's systematic, and it's targeting people based on their ethnicity and faith, which is producing a process of social elimination. An entire generation of young people like Iskander have been affected by this system. So I'll leave it there. Thanks so much for your attention.
I'd like to introduce Dr. Adrian ZENZ, who will present on the same topic of coercive labor and forced human displacement in Xinjiang's cross-regional labor transfer program. Dr. ZENZ is a senior fellow in China Studies of the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation in DC and holds a PhD in social anthropology, and I don't believe he needs much introduction. And he's come out with leading studies on this topic and birth prevention as well. Dr. ZENZ.
Thank you. There's a bit of an echo here, isn't it? I'll be speaking on the topic of forced labor and links to mass atrocities in Xinjiang's forced labor program.
Sorry, just one moment for the technical issues.
Okay, one moment with technical issues. Well, I think I can just start with the first slide because it's should be no problem. Then I hope the thing will be up eventually. So I'll be talking about Xinjiang's forced labor and if we can establish a link to mass atrocities such as crime against humanity or genocide. Now, Xinjiang operates two distinct forced or coercive labor programs, which I quite like to distinguish, and I probably am increasingly known for insisting on distinguishing them in order to have a clear understanding of the policy context of each of them, even though there are linkages between both of them. Together, they're very large in scope, and I think that's also another reason why it's important to see two different forced labor systems because they complement each other, and I mean the scope is actually really huge. They both target ethnic minorities, particularly Uyghurs. They both can cause internal displacement, linked to which can be referred to as human trafficking, although one of them does it much more so than the other. They constitute a long-term solution to the so-called Uyghur problem and are sort of like the phase 2 after the internment camps in many ways. The purpose of these forced labor systems is not just economic, but also political, which is also one reason why it would qualify as a crime against humanity. So we've just heard an excellent presentation from Darren BYLER, and his presentation pertains to the forced labor that's quite directly linked to the internment camps, in which then typically leads into a fairly, well, it can lead into a quite highly securitized work placement that can even be close to an internment camp or eventually somewhere else, where there's a greater police presence and higher degree of security. So the forced labor linked to the internment camps is part of a de-extremification policy, and it's designed to resettle camp graduates, quote unquote, back into society. It takes place within Xinjiang. For security and political reasons, those former detainees are typically not transferred to other destinations, other provinces. The scope is unknown. It could be possibly several 100,000 camp graduates who have been shifted into forced labor. We have one piece of documentary evidence from Kashgar saying that in 2018 alone, 100,000 were being shifted into forced labor from the camps. Forced labor linked to the internment camps is non-seasonal factory work. It's full-time factory work. And it is typically quite localized. Aha, there we go. It's often in the same prefecture. Darren gave an example of them then later being shifted to the provincial capital. That's of course possible as well. At times they're being sent home. But there's clearly not necessarily an emphasis on internal displacement, unless further research would suggest that. But there's every evidence that the purpose of this first forced labor program, please shift 2 slides. Yes, thank you. The purpose is very much local control. The second, so the first half of this slide shows what I've talked about, the forced labor linked to the internment camps. The second forced labor scheme is linked to poverty elevation through labor transfers. It's a scheme that's existed for quite a while, since the early 2000s, but it's become increasingly coercive, and it's complementing the other scheme, and it's very much targeting rural surplus laborers who typically would not have been to a camp, although there's not exclusionary criteria, I don't think. But the purpose here is to transfer rural surplus laborers who are, there's too many people working in agriculture, to transfer them to other sectors. And this is in the context of Xi Jinping's signature initiative of targeted poverty alleviation. And we find this type of coercive labor not just in Xinjiang, but also in Tibet. And this is one of the reasons why the conceptual distinction becomes so important, because Tibet does not have a big network of internment camps. So this kind of forced labor does not depend on the existence of camps. And I'm also in the process of documenting its existence in other places. The scope could be, I've in previous research estimated possibly up to 1.6 million at risk in Xinjiang alone. That would be out of a total of approximately 2.6 million rural surplus laborers. Some of them, of course, would be Han Chinese, but most, about 80–85%, are ethnic minorities. And there's different levels of coercion, and some would be higher at risk of coercion than others. This kind of labor involves both non-seasonal and seasonal work, meaning cotton picking, for example, falls under this category, or fruit picking. It ranges from very local employment to cross-provincial labor transfers, which we've heard about in the past. The Australian Strategic Policy Institute published on it. I kind of hinted at it in the 2019 publication. This pertains to this kind of scheme of forced labor. So, to recap, the displacement effect of the forced labor that's directly associated with the internment camp is relatively low on average. Work is often on or near a camp or a factory park. The camps often are in factory parks, or detainees are placed into work back home, sometimes supposedly returning to their original jobs, but also they can be placed into satellite factories, at which point they would work alongside, quite likely work alongside workers from the other labor schemes. There's hardly any statistics on that. The potential displacement through forced urbanization or family separation is real. The extent is unclear, it's subject to further research, but we clearly see that these detainees, and I think Darren has also indicated that, they may not go back home. They may be kept in urban settings or even resettled permanently. Although it's unclear to what extent this labor, like the settlement, is permanent. The focus of this is post-internment control and not displacement. Although we'll have to see, at least that's kind of the current state of knowledge. Now, the displacement effect of the poverty alleviation through labor transfer is quite different. Here we often see intentional displacement strategies, and it plays a smaller role in population optimization strategies, of which I will speak more tomorrow. There are narratives and academic discourses that clearly say that this labor is designed to break apart a hardened society, to dilute the influence of religion, to change the ethnic makeup of communities. The main effect is the separation of families, of parents from children, and the breaking apart of existing communities. Placement into much more state-controlled settings and control over whereabouts and movement. Thank you for moving the slides without me telling to do so. I forgot all about that. Could you go back, please, one? Yes, this one. Yeah, this one, yeah. So again, poverty evasion through labor transfer, most transfers are local. The goal of the whole scheme is not mainly geographical transfer, but a sectoral transfer. So the word transfer is deceptive. It's about shifting people from the primary to secondary and tertiary sectors. That's the primary meaning of the term transfer. This may or may not involve a physical relocation. In Xinjiang, Tibet, about 90% of transfers are local, only about 1% are cross-provincial. And there's one example from 2018 that shows that. So you have about 86%, 2.34 out of 2.73 million were transferred locally. That basically means in the same county or prefecture. Of course, there still can be displacement. These places are still very big, and there can be shift from rural to urban. Locally means, and then about 13.3% within Xinjiang, often from southern Xinjiang to more industrial Han-dominated parts in the north, and only a small number outside of Xinjiang. But in some Uyghur regions, these are statistics for all labor transfers of any ethnic group. But for some Uyghur regions in southern Xinjiang, the percentage is higher. For example, labor transfers of poor households in the south in 2018, 11% were transferred outside Xinjiang, not just 1%. In Aksu, for example, in 2017, only 58% of transfers were local, not 86%, and so on. So we see there can be a disproportionate targeting of Uyghurs to face displacement through longer distance transfers. Next slide, please. So Aaron Rosenberg, former senior advisor of the US Holocaust Museum for Genocide Prevention, who will be here later today and present or chair, conducted with several other legal experts an appraisal of the data that I published in March 2021 based on the Nankai report, a leaked document about describing labor transfers to other provinces. And the determination said that the crime against humanity of forcible transfer refers to a removal of civilians from a place where they lawfully live without their consent. This violates a protected right of persons to live in their communities and homes. There is such a right specified under the international law. And it is a crime against humanity to violate this right of persons to live in their communities and homes. So one can actually establish that the poverty alleviation through labor transfer scheme violates this principle and constitutes a crime, the crime against humanity of forcible transfer. In this, actual force is not required. It's sufficient to have a threat of possible physical or mental coercion or an overall coercive climate. So this certainly, that's also why it works for labor transfers that are not related to the camps. The analysis was not extended to labor related to camps, of course, which is more coercive. The labor related to camps, you have a even greater police presence and more security features, and Darren talked about that. So anyways, labor transfers that alter optimized population composition qualify as the crime against humanity of forcible transfer. Next slide, please. So I just done a little overview to see on the left-hand side under aspect, you see aspects of the genocide definition. And then you have the two forced labor schemes, internment camp forced labor and the other one. Now, serious bodily or mental harm is a very real risk with forced labor. You know, I am especially reminded of the ABC 60 Minutes, Australian ABC in summer of 2019, where this one a lady was doing a video chat with her sister, a Uyghur lady in forced labor. And she was holding up a note, and I didn't look up the detail, but it was about she didn't want to live anymore. She didn't want to live anymore. So it's like suicide intent. That's what this leads to. And of course, the other form of forced labor, highly depending on the conditions, of course, could of course be nearly as serious as that. The deliberate affliction condition of life to bring about physical destruction is, in my opinion, unlikely. Like they're not being starved to death as they work. I don't think, at least. Imposing measures intended to prevent births are made easier with forced labor, and Darren actually mentioned that too. And that applies to all cases. Of course, with the internment camp forced labor, I think it's generally more likely. But with the other one, it just really depends on where they're being transferred, where they work. Forcibly transferring children of one group to another, we have the situation where this promotes parent-child separation, depending on the location. So it's not very clear-cut. And of course, parent-child separation per se is not the same as a forcible transfer of children from one group to another directly. Next slide. So this is my final slide. It's interesting, I've never quite thought of the link between forced labor and genocide, but I think, of course, forced labor is a very important aspect of the cultural genocide that's going on, of the destruction of the culture, the religion, the customs, the family units, community units. But I think there is some contribution also, some contribution to physical destruction, because besides the breaking apart of family unit, of course, these can serve to destroy a group as a group. But I think there's also significant mental harm being done. And so even though there's no direct contribution to a large-scale destruction of lives, besides rendering birth prevention easier, forced labor is very much part of the long-term scheme of the CCP in the area. And I certainly would concur with James LEIBOLD that there is a strong project of colonialism going on, in which we can also conceptually situate all of this. And so forced labor is very importantly part of a long-term strategy to crush and remold and transform and re-educate these people, and in the process could contribute to a slow genocide. Thank you.
I want to make a quick note because I've been working a lot on analyzing the breaches of the Genocide Convention. Just a quick point, because I know Dr. Leibold also mentioned this, the intent to destroy a group as a distinct group, and I think it's important that Dr. ZENZ mentioned that, requires zero evidence of the mental states or what is in the minds of state officials. International law does not require that at all. So we look at what objectively is going on, the atrocities, and whether that points towards a destruction of a group. And so I'd like to now introduce Nyrola ELIMÄ. Is a supply chain analyst who regularly collaborates with the Helena Kennedy Center's Forced Labor Lab at Sheffield Hallam University and is co-author of In Broad Daylight, Uyghur Forced Labor and Global Solar Supply Chains. She will be speaking about this issue. Nyrola?
Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for your presentation. It was amazing. Professor Laura Murphy and I have been investigating the Uyghur forced labor in global supply chains since last September. A few months ago, we published a report of the solar industry. Our report documents that China has placed millions of indigenous Uyghur and Kazakhs from Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region into what the government calls surplus labor and labor transfer programs. The Chinese government claims that the workers in this program are engaged voluntarily. However, the evidence that driven from the government and company source reveals that the labor transfer are deployed in Xinjiang with an environment of coercion by the constant threat of re-education and internment. Next, please. Next. When we trace a supply chain all the way back to the very early source, we usually look at A, are they engaging labor transfers? Are these workers under a constant threat that they would be sent to a camp? Did workers lose their land? Did workers leave their parents and kids behind? Are they allowed to have some private time? Are they subject to strict controls and constant surveillance? Next, please. The information about this usually can be found on the local news, articles, government directives, and company source, such as their CSR report and or the annual report. It's not difficult to find because the government and the cooperate really likes to celebrate their policy towards the indigenous workers. Usually they will celebrate how they have successfully changed and Uyghur ideology through the labor, vocational training, and patriotic education, how the government has won the ideological combat with the help of the patriotic education, with labor, with training. For example, they will usually mention after work, Uyghur workers, Kazakh workers must participate in the patriotic education. Then according to the Chinese propaganda, not according to me, not Laura, according to the Chinese government propaganda, a lazy, radical, stubborn Uyghur or Kazakh worker will suddenly become a modern citizen, and he or she is so grateful for the government or the party that have saved his life or her life from the extremist ideology. Next, please. B, are government officers or recruiters going to house keep asking the indigenous worker to leave so the government can assign them to the labor program. And then did they also assign the Uyghur or Kazakh person a point value? The point system will determine how far a person's workplace will be from home. Those who need to be controlled are sent for the training. Next slide, please. Sorry, I forgot to tell you. The point system will determine how far a person's work placement will be from home. Those who need to be controlled are sent for training, all others sent to the work, either close to home or across the country. Someone asked us once, the labor transfer program is very common in China, so why is the labor transfer program in Xinjiang is a problem? Our answer was that for the last 4 years, since the camp emerged across Xinjiang, it is clear 100% of the people are not allowed to refuse the state-sponsored labor program. This program exists in other parts of China, but in Xinjiang alone, the poverty elevation program, which is including surplus labor, and the labor transfer program is designed on a logic that indigenous work people, Uyghur people, Kazakh people, Kyrgyz people, who don't actively participate or refuse to participate is affected by the separatism, extremism, terrorism. If a person doesn't want to comply with the state-sponsored labor transfer program offered to them, then they're deemed to be a radical and a potential terrorist and can be sent to an internment camp. And this is drawn directly from the government directives. This is why the US government, lawyers, and experts on forced labor have determined that the labor transfer, as they have been practiced in Xinjiang, constitute forced labor. Next, please. Say, are they co-located? We usually will look at every site of we could try to see if this company, these factories, are they near or co-located with the camp or any kind of the detention facility, pre-jail, 看守所, 拘留所, or hardcore prison. D, what is their engagement with Xinjiang Production and Construction Corps, aka XPCC, getting any subsidy support from the XPCC? And the last one, I forgot put it in my presentation, but thanks to the Hannah's presentation, she mentioned about the class merged. We also look at the child labor, Uyghur child labor, Kazakh child labor. In Chinese terminology, they're using a terminology called 两后生. I never found the correct translation towards this in English or in Swedish. I just don't know what is the 两后生 in English. This is a phenomenon that the kids, Uyghur kids, Kazakh kids, they don't have any chance to continue their education because of the class merge, school merge. So imagine, let's say, an English speaker who has been learning English for her entire primary school, middle school, and one day the government decided from today, all of you gonna send it to a Swedish school. So even you are an A-Street student in a Uyghur language school or English school, then all the textbook change it to the Han Chinese, change it to the Swedish. You cannot compete it with a Han Chinese kid. And you need to take the exam to enter into high school, enter into the university. Everything is in English, in Mandarin. Uyghur kid lost their chance, continue to study in a high school, in a college. So what is the fate waiting for these kids? They have to go to the vocational training school, not the camp, probably not the camp, a boarding school with only train them become a skilled worker. So this is why during my tracing for the supply chain, in the supply chain or forced labor, I constantly see the picture of the kids sitting there working, whether in the shoes factories or textile factories, or they're learning skills. This kid's supposed to study in the high school. So I haven't seen any media has been reporting this. Probably it's very difficult to get the first-hand evidence. Also, I guess like me, I don't have the quantitative data. I don't have the statistic. As a data analyst, I need to have the number. But unfortunately, all I see is now is the Chinese government media celebrate about 两后生 program. Next. So let's see the solar industry as an example. So most people, when they talk about the raw materials in the solar industry, are talking about the polysilicon. So our report went one step further to look at where the actual rocks coming from and how that might affect it. And then turns out it's quite shocking. The problem is a company called Hoshan Silicon Industry. Hoshan is a company that produces metallurgical grade silicon that get transformed into polysilicon. So the Hoshan, this company has been participated in the labor transfer programs and has exposure to the forced labor through its quartz supplier. The company not only shipped directly to the United States, but also other companies inside and outside of the Xinjiang. When Hoshan moved to a town called Shanshan, which is right outside the Turpan, so in 2016, the local resource bureau was already ready for them. Local government said in the Xinjiang news, said, we have already met the Hoshan. We understood that Hoshan needs 5,000 workers, but we did even better. We trained 9,000 workers in the special skills that Hoshan might need it, and we're ready to provide labor transfer. We have gone to door, and we have found all the people that need to be employed. We have trained all the people that need to be trained, and we're ready to supply Hoshan with their employees. So Hoshan comes in and then recruit fairs, where they promise they will transfer surplus rural laborers into industry workers, making them become fresh combat troops for industrialization, urbanization. So one of our study case was Mdin family. This married couple from Deakin Township, where they were targeted for the poverty elevation. The local government decided that this couple needed an income increasing package, which began with a cadre was instruct them in Chinese language skills, to which I called pay the way for them to leave their hometown to work. The regional work team then assigned the couple to vocational skills training to learn to be BYLER in the farming off-season. The couple followed and obeyed, but that wasn't enough. The regional worker team telling them to do pre-employment training for the surplus labor force so they can be transferred to work at Hoshan. The couple doesn't want to leave because they have ill parents. So the government said, well, don't worry, we can fix it. So they bought the medicines. These couples still don't want to leave, so they told the cadre that their 7 acres of grape fields would need to be tending. Then the government said, don't worry, we will release your worry. And next things happened, this couple lost their land because the land, the use right has been transferred to the state. The couple lost their land. And now the Mdin couple then transferred to the Hoshan, more than 50 kilometers away from home, to work as a mechanic and a product inspector to the Shanshan County Hoshan Silicon Industry Factory, leaving behind their children, leaving behind their ill parents. According to the article, the couple have a very beautiful house in the village, but now they're living in a bunk door with other employees at the Xinjiang Hoshan and rarely return home. This couple we're married couple not supposed to living with other people in a bunk dorm. That's my point. Sorry. So and they're rarely return home, but every time when they have the chance go back to home, they will be exhibited as a modern citizen, and then they will participate in the new recruiting. So the Hoshan and the local government use them as example to continue to have the new labor. Every company knows their supply chains. They know where their stuff come from. So if an industry deliberately neglect the forced labor human rights abuse issues in the supply chains, it is quite scandalous. I am a supply chain analyst. Every time when I look at these kind of things, I'm not happy. What company can do is spend a little bit time or energy to look at the value chains and to make sure their stuff is not tainted by the forced labor. And that's it. Thank you.
And indeed, this might be the one area where we can most have an impact outside of China to end the violence and prevent further atrocities through our corporations. So I think we have time for maybe one or two questions from the audience. No, I defer to Joe or Hannah.
Speak into here. Oh, sorry, I project quite a bit as, as a singer. Hi, Elise Anderson from the Uyghur Human Rights Project. My question is mostly for James LEIBOLD, although Adrian also picked this up as well. I appreciate the kind of interjection of the need to think about colonialism, right, and colonial intent. But I would ask, does colonial intent preclude genocidal intent, especially given what we know about colonial genocides that have happened elsewhere, including in places like the United States, Canada, Australia? Thank you.
Hi, this is Nathan. Dr. Leopold's gone to sleep, but I'm taking his place with the questions. Could you repeat the first bit of that? Sorry, I missed what Elise said.
I think she was asking about how this compares to colonial genocides in North America.
Yeah, well, I think from my perspective, that's one of the things that has personally made me sort of most comfortable referring to this as a genocide. Well, I realized my camera isn't on. This is Nathan Roosa, by the way, from ASPE. And I think that when I thought about, like, when we hear about what's happening in Xinjiang, I think it's very relevant to put that into the context of the Canadian boarding schools or the Australian stolen generation. And during one of the presentations today, I can't remember precisely who said it. I think it may have been Darren, but sort of talking about the ethnic extinction that was used in policy language regarding some of the policies that are happening in Xinjiang. It reminded me a lot of the Australian mentality during the stolen generation, that the Australian Indigenous people were sort of a failed people, and that if you let nature take their course, they will naturally go extinct with the sort of Western colonizers taking their place because of this eugenic superiority. And that's something that really struck me when I think it was Darren was talking earlier. And I think it's very important to sort of look at the history of US, Canadian, and Australian genocides in the context of this.
And Dr. ZENZ, did you want to add anything?
So I referred to it briefly in order to affirm that this is colonialism, but I entirely concur with Elise that this is also genocide. Although the argument for that I'll be making tomorrow, and the evidence for that I'll be presenting tomorrow. I was today talking about crimes against humanity because I was only presenting on forced labor. I'll have more to say about genocide tomorrow.
Do we want to take one more?
Hi, this is Avi Ackerman from the Jewish Movement for Uyghur Freedom. This is directed to anybody who can answer it, but I had in mind especially Dr. BYLER. So you talked about this form of negative eugenics that's being practiced, and I'm wondering how this interacts with the coerced marriages, if there's also some sort of ideology present of positive eugenics, of some sort of alleged benefit of the mixing of Han genes with the now stigmatized Uyghur phenotype, or however else they might conceptualize it. Thanks.
Interesting question. There's a lot of discussion about blood infusion as part of what's happening in the re-education campaign. Although I think mostly they're thinking more metaphorically or more about just bringing Han people into the region. and that once the new blood arrives, then they're supposed to like begin to generate their own good blood, I guess. I think there is a government program that's incentivizing. I don't think, and I know that there's a government program that's incentivizing marriage between Han people and Uyghurs, and they're often celebrated as model marriages of ethnic solidarity and stability, or social stability. We don't know the scale, or I don't know the scale of forced marriages or coercive marriages. And there's also, I think, some variation in terms of how much coercion is in the marriage. But it's certainly a positive eugenics program. That seems quite clear, that bringing Han people into intimate contact with Uyghurs is encouraged, while Uyghur reproduction itself is discouraged. It's just the numbers have yet to be fully vetted and uncovered. So that's how I'll leave it at that.
Thanks, Darren. And I wish we could continue, but I think we have a lot to get through today. So thank you for all our panelists.